Hello everyone, this is Professor Casey. Welcome to our first lesson for INRW 0090. This is a lesson that's a pretty basic one and one that just kind of introduces everybody to the idea of the parts of speech in the English language and kind of how it all ends up fitting together to form a full sentence. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of sentence diagramming. We're going to look specifically at what words in the English language fall under which category when it comes to the parts of speech. This may be a lesson that is very, very simple to some of you. You may be very familiar with this already. If you are, that's fine. You already have a leg up in things here, so just be a little bit patient with me here, and we'll get through this one first. When it comes to the contents of this lesson, there's two main branches that we'll get into. The first one is the parts of speech themselves, kind of how words themselves are categorized in English. And the second one is what I call mechanics, okay? So how some of the words are actually used in sentences. So we start very basically with the English language, and this is something that all languages all over the world end up inheriting certain parts of speech when it comes to things like nouns and so forth from much, much earlier forms of language. Okay, and one of the primary building blocks of language of any kind, and English especially, is nouns. Okay, nouns are any word that is a person, a place, a thing, or an idea. Okay, again, this is the most basic building block of just about any language that there is. Okay, and most people have a general understanding of nouns in the first three ways, right? A person, a place, or a thing. Okay, anything you can reach out and touch. Okay, anything that really appeals to the five senses is what you can consider a noun to be. And an idea is a little bit more of an abstract way of looking at things. So we have two real different types of nouns. We have concrete nouns, which is what most people think of, right? Anything you can experience with the five senses, okay? So something like a cat, the country of France, right? Or a cup, right? These types of things are all considered concrete nouns, okay? And what I mean by concrete, again, is just anything you can reach out and touch or experience in a physical way, okay? So a place like France is a place you can actually visit. You can be there. Okay, a cat is something you can pet. A cup is something you can drink from. Right, we kind of have the basic idea here. Now, when it comes to abstract nouns, these are something that are a little bit more, a little bit harder to quantify, really, because these are things that you can't really see in any physical form because they don't really exist in a physical form, right? They need something else to represent them somehow, right? A symbol of some kind, because they're an idea, right? They're something that exists in what we call a non-corporeal form, right? They don't have any kind of physical form. So something like liberty, for example, okay, right? Liberty is an idea that we have right here in America, right? We represent it with the Statue of Liberty, okay? But liberty, again, doesn't really have a physical form necessarily. Emotions like silliness or anger, right? These are things that, again, they take on a form when people experience them or they represent them somehow, like what you see here. And even something like a government, a religion, a dream, right? Anything like that. Those are all technically nouns because they exist, but they don't really have a physical form of some kind, right? They need something else to represent them. So again, nouns are the most basic thing that we can talk about when it comes to English, right? Something that can actually do something or that can be experienced somehow. Now, the other part of that, the other part that is a building block of language that really makes it work is a verb. Okay, and a verb is any kind of action that a noun can perform. Okay, so it can be something as simple as existing. Okay, existing is something that everything around us technically does, right? So, just saying I am, right, is really saying, I being a pronoun, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and am being the verb. Okay, and those are the two most basic things that you need in order to make a complete sentence: a noun and a verb, right? Something doing an action and the action that it is doing. Okay? So again, verbs are any kind of action that can be performed by a noun. And we tend to think of verbs as being something that is an active verb of some kind, right? Something that requires you to actually perform an action, right? To get up, to move around, to put effort into something is what most people think of, right? That's what we think of as an active verb. There are, though, other things called passive verbs. And a passive verb is something that you are performing an action, or something is performing an action, but it's doing it in a way that doesn't seem to require any effort. Okay, so again, just the act of existing, right, just being somewhere, okay, is something that is technically a passive verb. Okay, gravity is technically holding everything down right now. Okay, you might be sitting in a chair like I am. You might be, your heart is beating, you're breathing whether you realize it or not, right? You're hearing sounds all around you. Okay, so really we live in a universe of nouns that are performing verbs at all times, whether we realize it or not. Okay, the oxygen particles are moving through the air, the light particles are moving through the air, the planets are revolving around the sun, right? The earth is rotating, grass is growing, right? Things that we don't really take into consideration are happening all around us all the time. Okay, so anything around you right now is technically performing a verb, whether you realize it or not. So again, we tend to think of this in terms of active verbs, right? Walk, swim, jump, sing, dance, right? These are all active verbs, again, things that require some sort of effort to actually to happen. Okay, but again, passive verbs also are occurring all the time, whether we realize it or not. Now, expanding a little bit beyond nouns and verbs, we also have something called adjectives. Okay, and adjectives is any kind of a description word that you can attach to a noun. Okay, to give it more dimension, to explain perhaps what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it smells like, what it feels like. Again, this goes along with the five senses, okay? Anything you can use to explain a noun to somebody who perhaps has never seen it or experienced it is called an adjective, okay? And this can be anything, okay? This can be something like happy, right? The word happy can be used to describe a person, can be used to describe a situation, can be used to describe a pet when you come home from work, okay? Beautiful is something, again, that is worthy of, or that has the properties of beauty. Okay, so it can be a sunset or a beautiful landscape like this. You can describe a person as beautiful. You can describe a pattern, a color, music as beautiful. Anything can be described that way. You can also have somebody or something be grumpy, right? Grumpy is, again, kind of an emotion, right? You've heard of the Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, okay? Each one of the dwarves, with the exception, I think, of Doc, is technically an adjective of some kind, right? Grumpy, sneezy, dopey, happy, sleepy, etc. Okay. Exhausted, of course, is another thing. You can be exhausted like this poor puppy is. And, of course, there are some things that are just downright frightening. Have to inject a little bit of humor once in a while. So again, adjectives don't necessarily just provide flavor and dimension to our world, but they can be really helpful too. Okay? If I give you an example and say, there's a snake on the floor, okay? Right? The snake is a noun, okay? And most people know that to back away from a snake anyway. Most people kind of have an aversion to snakes. If I say there is a venomous snake on the floor, then you really know to back away. Okay, because venomous in this case is an adjective telling you that this snake is venomous, right? If you get bitten by this snake, you will probably die. Okay, so you have to be very careful with that. Another example is if you ever see a truck, right, that carries gasoline or something, you might see a sign on the side that says flammable. Okay, flammable means that if any kind of a spark or fire breaks out around it, it's going to blow up. Okay, so if you're going to have a smoke, right, you don't want to do it near a truck that has the word flammable on it, or a propane tank or anything like that. Okay, so there are words around us that act as adjectives that also act as preventative measures, right, saying that something is dangerous, flammable, that a road can be slippery when wet, or a bridge can be icy when it's cold, right? These types of things just help keep us in line and keep us safe. Okay, so adjectives provide a lot more than just added dimension to our world. They also just help us survive in some cases. Now, a close cousin to the adjective is something called an adverb. Okay, so if an adjective describes a noun, an adverb, as you might imagine, describes verbs. Okay, and adjectives and adverbs get mixed up all the time, so it's very easy to do this. It's very forgivable if you do get them mixed up, so don't get too confused here. Adverbs, in many cases, but not all cases, most cases tend to end with ly on the end of the word, just like you see here in all these examples. Now, this is not a 100% rule all the time. English ends up breaking its own rules in many cases. But a lot of the time, an adverb is an adjective that has had ly added onto the end of it. Okay? So if I give you an example here, the word nimbly, the very first word that you see there, okay, in the adjective form, okay, if you're describing a person, okay, what we have here, this little cartoon fellow up here at the top, this comes from an old nursery rhyme. It says, Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick. Okay, so Jack is this fellow here, and we're describing him as nimble. Okay, and nimble, if you look at him here, means that he's someone who's light on his feet. Okay, nimble just means someone who is able to move around really easily. They're fast. They can jump over things very easily, right? They have a good range of motion. Okay, so if we're describing Jack, then he is nimble. Okay, because Jack is a noun. Okay, so a noun and an adjective go together that way. Now, if we're going to use the adverb nimbly, then we're describing his action. Okay, the act of him jumping. Okay, he jumps nimbly. Okay, so that's the main difference here, is knowing what it is you're describing. If we're describing Jack personally, then we're calling him nimble. But if we're describing the act of him jumping, then we're describing the jump as something that he's doing nimbly. Okay, so it's a little bit confusing sometimes. Again, adjectives and adverbs are very easily mixed up, so don't feel too confused here. But I'll give you some more examples. Glad and gladly are another distinction here. Okay, this is a character from Popeye, the old cartoon series. His name was Wimpy, and he constantly says, I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. Okay, he's basically trying to get a free meal out of everybody all the time. He never pays them back. Okay, so he's glad to get a hamburger. Okay, if we're describing Wimpy, we're describing him as glad, but we're describing him paying gladly. Okay, so again, the distinction here is what we're describing. Are we describing him as a noun, or are we describing his emotion or his action as an adverb, gladly? Okay, so that's the main difference here. Right, here's another example. Okay, this cat is reacting gratefully to being rescued by a firefighter. Okay, the cat is glad, okay, but it is reacting gladly. Okay, so again, all depends on what we're describing here. Okay. If we talk about Wonder Woman, okay, use a superhero example here. Wonder Woman is wonderful, right, as her name suggests, right? And she acts wonderfully. Okay, that's why she gets her name. And of course, you might have a coworker or someone around you, a family member perhaps, right, who is annoying, like this fellow here is. If you ever watch Parks and Recreation, you recognize the characters. And of course, he's acting annoyingly. Okay, so again, adverbs is any time we're using a word to describe an action. Okay, and most of the time, like I said, this tends to end with ly. It's not always the case, right? We do have a few examples that don't, but for the purposes of this class, we'll keep it simple and we'll just say most of the time they end with ly, and that's the easiest way to recognize them. Now, pronouns is another thing that we can talk about here. Okay, and pronouns, again, as you can tell from the name itself, right, it relates to nouns. Okay, a noun, remember, is a person, place, thing, or idea. A pronoun is any word that can take the place of a noun in a sentence, so you're not just using the same word over and over and over again. And it usually designates some sense of gender and perhaps even neutrality, right, something that is neither male nor female. And of course, pronouns, when it comes to social constructs, right, this is a whole discussion that we could potentially have, right? You could get very philosophical about this. But pronouns, of course, is what a lot of people these days look at when they use some sort of identity for themselves. Okay? But in the case of pronouns here, if we're looking at it as objectively as we can, okay, we have examples here, again, that tend to be either male or female, and in some cases, neutral, neither male nor female. When I have students who come from other cultures, for example, if you come from a country or if you speak a language that is Latin-based, for example, French or Spanish, something along those lines, typically nouns in those particular languages tend to be either male or female. Okay? In many cases, there is not any kind of neutral word that is a noun of any kind. Okay? So when it comes to pronouns, sometimes this can get a little bit confusing, okay? Because in English, we don't always designate male or female for an inanimate object, okay? For something that doesn't really have a gender, unless we're talking about a human being, or if we're talking about an animal, or perhaps even a plant that is either male or female, then we can usually say he or she. But if we're talking about something like a computer or a pencil or a desk or something like that, we usually just use it because, again, it's neither male nor female, at least in English anyway. So again, in some languages, I'll give you an example or two here. If we're talking about in French, okay, the word livre, right, le livre, is a word that means the book, okay? And because it has le, L-E, at the beginning of it, that means that it is male. Okay, so books are considered male when it comes to the French language. If we look at the Spanish word la mesa, okay, la mesa is a female word because of the word la, L-A at the beginning. Okay, so desk in Spanish is a female word, and book in French is a male word. Okay, again, neither one of these objects technically has a gender of any kind, right? We can't recognize it as male or female in the human sense. But if we talk about them in English, right, we use it as pronouns because it's just something that is inanimate, right? It doesn't have a life of its own. Okay, so again, can be a little bit confusing, and again, can be a little bit philosophical here. But for the sake of pronouns in most cases, if we're talking about a male, then we're talking about him, he, right, that kind of thing, his. And if we're talking about female, it's her, hers, she, that kind of thing. And sometimes when it comes to pop culture and so forth, people get creative when it comes to pronouns. And, you know, some of it is not always politically correct, but sometimes it's just kind of funny to recognize. So you might have a character like He-Man, for example. Okay, this is a character that is very predominantly male, okay, very muscular and so forth. His cousin is called She-Ra because she is a female. And sometimes you have an oddity like Cousin It from the Addams Family, right? If you ever watched the old TV series, okay? He's just a big blob of hair with a hat and sunglasses, right? We don't know if it's male or female, but it's an it, okay? So again, pronouns, it's a whole can of worms when it comes to philosophy and sociology. There's all kinds of discussions you could have about this, but looking at it as objectively as we can, typically there are those three different categories of pronouns: male, female, and neutral. Prepositions are something that is a little bit more confusing, okay? You have to think about the world and the universe in three dimensions around you. What I mean by that is you have to think of everything when it comes to what we call proximity. Okay? Proximity just means how close or how far away things are from you. Okay? So just looking at the space around you right now, you'll find that you can relate to something around you using a word called a preposition. Okay? So in other words, a noun that relates in distance or in time to another noun can be connected by a word called a preposition. Okay? And again, this usually shows the relationship between one or more nouns, two or more nouns really, using location or time. Okay? So I'll give you an example here. If we look at this little cartoon here, okay, we have two nouns really present in this cartoon. We have the rock, and we have this little guy hiding underneath it. Okay. And the word that we use to describe the relationship between the two is under. Okay? If we're talking about the guy, this little cartoon guy down here, the guy is under the rock. Okay? So guy and rock are our two nouns here, and under is the word you would use to describe the guy's relationship to the rock. If we flip it around and we say the rock is on top of or over the guy, okay, then it still works because now we're talking about the rock itself and how the rock relates to the guy. Okay, kind of see how that works. Again, it's a little bit confusing sometimes. It's hard to wrap your head around, but again, when it comes to nouns and verbs, the universe around us is, again, full of nouns constantly performing actions, and we can recognize how the two relate using prepositions. Okay, the planets revolve around the sun. Okay, so planets and sun would be our two nouns. Okay, and then around is the preposition that is used to describe the movement, the location. Okay. This is a funny little cartoon. It says here, I'm the first person to ever clone myself. The guy says, that's amazing. I'm sure you're pretty excited. And then the guy says, I'm beside myself. Okay. So this is supposed to be a play on words, but saying that he is beside himself, right? He is standing right next to himself, literally. Okay? It's also a figure of speech meaning I'm excited. Okay. I'm beside myself. I'm so excited. Again, English doesn't always make sense. You could use a word like within or inside to talk about the dog's relationship to the dog house, right? The dog is within the dog house, or the dog is inside the house. And a word like up. Okay, this is from the Disney Pixar movie Up. Okay, and again, any word that you can use to describe movement or location. Up, down, left, right, forward, backward, side to side, right? Before and after, okay? All of these words are called prepositions, okay? It's how you or something else relates to something, okay? So again, you might be sitting in the chair, you might have a computer on a desk, you might have a roof over your head, okay? You might have a dog on the couch, right? Something like that. All of these are examples of prepositions and how they relate to one another. Okay? So again, you have to think a little bit philosophically here, but you also just have to think in terms of the three dimensions. Okay? Forward, backward, side to side, up and down. Now, conjunctions are very specific words that are used in the English language, okay? And these are words that link two ideas together in a sentence, okay? And if you ever watch, there is an old cartoon series that used to come on TV, and it gets used sometimes in classrooms even today. It comes from the 50s and 60s called Schoolhouse Rock. Okay, and if you look on YouTube or something like that, I'm sure you can find this. But it was these little sing-along cartoons that would be educational somehow. And one of the cartoons that constantly gets stuck in everybody's head, everybody who's ever seen this cartoon still can call forth the rhythm and the song and everything today, called Conjunction Junction. And it's a cartoon that teaches people how to use conjunctions in a sentence. And in the cartoon, you have a little conductor, this little guy right here, and he basically shows everybody how to put these words together in a sentence. Okay? Now, the words that we're really going to be concerned about are the words that you see here by the word examples: and, but, or, however, and because. Okay? And what we mean by that is these are words that are connecting ideas together in a sentence. Okay? So if I put together two ideas, if I say the dog walks as one idea, okay, it's a noun and a verb, right? Puts forth the full idea, the dog walks. And if I have the cat runs on the other side, okay, again, it's a complete idea, cat runs. Now, the word that I use to link these ideas together in a sentence, if I want to make it all one big sentence, is a conjunction. Okay, so if I say the dog walks and the cat runs, then we have a full sentence now, and the conjunction connects them all together. Okay, and if you ever watch the cartoon, right? Again, if you go on YouTube and watch it, the way that they give examples of doing this is they use train cars, okay? How different train cars connect together, okay? And the way that you connect them is using a conjunction, okay? You use some kind of link to link all these ideas together in a sentence in order for it to work, okay? So you could say the dog walks and the cat runs. The dog walks, but the cat runs, okay? But ends up basically deferring your attention away from the dog to look at the cat, right? That's the meaning of it. Or doesn't really work there, and neither does however, okay? That's a completely, it's comparing things, or again, diverting attention away. But you could also say the dog walks because the cat runs, okay? Then you have cause and effect, okay? And technically, all these other little puzzle piece words that you see over here in the box are also conjunctions. I won't make you memorize or know any of these words really for the purpose of this class, because it gets a little bit difficult after a while. But these words are also technically recognized as conjunctions. Okay? So you'll see how conjunctions all fit together once we get into a few examples here. Now, interjections is something that a lot of people are not really familiar with, and when it comes to the term anyway, but we use them all the time, whether we realize it or not. Okay? And I'll give you a very specific example that will help explain this. If you imagine waking up in the middle of the night, okay, and you have to use the restroom, or you have to go get a drink of water, whatever the case may be. If you're walking through a dark house, a dark apartment, wherever you live, and you accidentally stub your toe on a piece of furniture, a chair, a coffee table, something like that, okay, now you're in pain. Whatever comes out of your mouth when you feel that pain is called an interjection, okay? It's a response, a reaction, an outburst of some kind, okay? And sometimes it's just a sound, okay? If you stub your toe, you might just go, ow, or something like that. You might just make a sound of some kind. Sometimes you get creative with this, okay? When it comes to the English language especially, and of course plenty of other languages too, this could devolve into obscenities. Okay, you might end up using curse words in this case, and a lot of curse words are considered interjections of some kind, again, used as an outburst, and people get very creative with this. Okay, but when it comes to recognizing them in a sentence, if you're looking at it being read to you, right, somehow, interjections are easy to identify because they all come in all caps, okay, which means they are all fully sized letters. Okay, so a word like wow, right, is a reaction. It's an outburst of surprise, okay. Ouch, right, if you're actually, going to use the G-rated version here of injuring yourself. Or yay, right? If you get a promotion, if you get to go home from work early, whatever the case may be, right? There's all kinds of different interjections that exist, okay? And it could be, any kind of reaction or outburst. It's usually an emotional one, though, okay? Or a reaction to something, pain, pleasure, excitement, anger, right? Can be any number of things, sadness, right? And we have all kinds of words that are used to describe this. And again, you see these used even sometimes in comic books or something like that, right? They have this kind of, big verse like this. So again, interjections, we use them all the time. We just don't always realize it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a couple of examples here, okay? How all of this that we've just talked about, the parts of speech, how it all fits together in a sentence, okay? So the example I've got here says the brown mouse ran quickly across the room. Okay, so this can be an example we can use. Now, the first thing that people tend to ask about when it comes to a sentence like this is a word like the very first word you see in the sentence, the. Okay, sometimes you will have a or an in a sentence as well. Okay, the, a, and an are something that we call articles. Okay, and I won't make you really know articles for this class, but an article is any kind of word that designates something specific or in general. Okay, and what I mean by that is if we're talking about the brown mouse, okay, then we're talking about this specific brown mouse. Okay, the only one that we're talking about. If I say a brown mouse, okay, it can be any brown mouse anywhere in the world, right? That's general. But if I say the brown mouse or this brown mouse, okay, if I'm pointing specifically to this one, then we're talking about something specific. So that's the difference here, is articles tell the difference between something specific and something in general. Okay, so again, you don't necessarily have to know that for the purposes of this class because, again, it's something that can be a little bit technical. So now, for the rest of this sentence, we'll talk about the different parts of speech that exist. Okay, so the nouns in this sentence, we have two different nouns. Okay, in this case, we have mouse and room. Okay, the mouse is the noun that's performing the action in this sentence, and the room is where it is. The verb here, of course, is ran. Okay, this is the action that the mouse is doing. Okay, we only have two nouns in the sentence, and in order for a sentence to make sense, okay, we have to have at least one noun performing an action. It has to be doing a verb of some kind. And the mouse is the only noun in the sentence doing an action. Okay, the room is not really doing anything. When it comes to adjectives, okay, again, back to the two nouns that we have, one of them has a description word attached to it, and the other one does not. Okay, in this case, we know it's a brown mouse. Okay, could be a gray mouse, could be a purple mouse, right? It could be any color. Okay, but in this case, the word brown is used to describe the mouse. And when it comes to colors, too, just as a side note, colors can be nouns, really, if we're talking about them objectively. Okay, depends on the context of the sentence. Okay, if we're talking about the color green, for example, right, just describing the color green, just discussing green as a noun itself, then it acts as a noun. But if we're using the color green to describe Kermit the Frog, okay, then it becomes an adjective. Okay, so same thing here. Okay, brown, if we're just talking about the color brown, right? It could be the color of coffee, the color of leather, whatever it is. Then we're talking about it as a noun. But if we're using it here to describe the color of a mouse, then it becomes an adjective. Okay? So again, it all depends on how it works in the sentence. The adverb here can be very easy to recognize because, again, it has ly on the end of it. Okay, quickly. Now we're describing the action of the mouse. Okay, again, the mouse is the only noun performing an action, and the action it's performing is the word ran. Okay, mouse ran quickly. And the preposition in the sentence, okay, is the word across. It's the only word we're left with. Okay, and this describes the relationship between the mouse, how it runs, and the room itself. Okay, so the mouse runs across the room. Okay, describes the location and the movement and the relationship between the mouse and the room. So again, looking at all this put together, okay, it can be a little confusing. Hopefully I've explained it well enough. But we'll do another example here just to kind of hammer home the point. Speaking of hammers, okay, we can see what could have happened to this guy here. It says, "Ow!" Tom yelled loudly when he caught his finger in the door. Okay, we have a few more words here now that end up coming into play. This is a little bit more of a complicated sentence. So here we have three different nouns that are working. We have Tom, the guy who has just hurt his finger. We have finger itself, okay, a finger, right, the digit coming off of your hand, and the door itself, okay, the thing that he has apparently hurt his finger on. Now, pronouns, we're talking about something that designates gender or potentially neutrality here. And here we have the word he and his, okay? He and his refer to Tom, okay? This is Tom's finger, okay, that we're talking about. So the two pronouns we have here are he and his, okay? We're talking about Tom specifically as a male. Verbs here, though, okay, we have two. We have yelled. This is something that Tom has done. And he's also caught. Okay, caught is where you get something stuck. Okay. The adverb here is loudly. Again, just like we had with the mouse before, we have something ending with ly. Tom yelled loudly. We're describing his action. The preposition we have here, we actually have two. There's a second one I forgot to add. Preposition when can be used to describe the time that this happens. Okay, he yelled loudly when he caught his finger. Okay, and the word in. okay? A word used to describe the location where he caught his finger. Okay? And finally, the interjection could be the most easy one to recognize. Ow. Okay? It's a weird word that makes a sound. Okay, right? It represents a sound that he is making here out of pain. Okay? So again, this is how a sentence could potentially be diagrammed, how you can look at the different parts of speech and how they relate to each other. Now we can move on very quickly here to 2 or 3 slides when it comes to the mechanics of words and how they're used in sentences. Now that you have a general understanding of the parts of speech, now we can see how the words are used. Now, capitalization is something that is very, very specific when it comes to the English language. We only capitalize words in 2 different situations. Either when they are proper nouns, okay, and a proper noun is the name of a person, a place, or something like that, right? Something that exists as, a city name, as a person's name, as a pet's name, that sort of thing. Or if it begins a sentence, a new sentence. So for example here, we have Bob from the Minions, okay? And not only is he named Bob, in this case he is King Bob, right? If you ever have watched the Minions, it's one of my favorite scenes, right? King Bob. Here we have Bob with the title King attached to it, and I chose this very specifically for this case. Anytime you have a title attached to a person's name, the title is also capitalized, okay? So Bob has a capital B in it, and King would have a capital K in it. So King Bob. Okay? And the same thing goes for any other title that you can assign. Okay? Captain America, Queen Elizabeth, right? President so-and-so, Captain so-and-so, Major so-and-so, Principal so-and-so, Professor so-and-so. Okay? Anytime you have a title attached to a person's name, then the title is capitalized. If you just have the title by itself, though, the president, the king, the instructor, whatever, then it's not capitalized. Okay, so it all depends on if you have a title attached to a name. Again, you might have a pet, like I do. This is Peanut. She's a dachshund. Right? Peanut would be capitalized, right, because it's her name. You might have a city that you like to go to, right? San Diego. This is where my wife and I had our honeymoon. Okay, San Diego would be capitalized. And sometimes you even have a work of art, like the Mona Lisa. Okay, this would be capitalized as well, okay, because it's a proper name for something very famous. So works of art, famous vehicles, okay, or vessels, right? The Titanic, the Batmobile, the Spirit of St. Louis, right? Any one of these things can be considered that. You might have the name of a building, Notre Dame Cathedral, for example, right? Something like that. Right? There's all kinds of ways that nouns are proper nouns. Okay, we can assign names to people, to places, to things, and we can turn them into something with a proper noun. Okay, company names, government names, religious names, these types of things. Okay, so there's all kinds of ways that we can enhance nouns and make them into something more. Now, compound words is something that exists in English that can be kind of fun to mess around with. It's something, again, that can be a little bit philosophical, and it's something that we use all the time and don't really think about. A compound word is anytime we have 2 or more words that exist in and of themselves in the English language, and we mash them together, and we create a brand new word. Okay? So something like scarecrow, for example. Okay? Scare is a word, and crow is a word. Okay? They mean something in and of themselves. But if we mash them together, then we create scarecrow. Okay? And the word scarecrow makes sense because it really describes what the thing is. A scarecrow exists to scare crows. Okay? Footstool is another one. Okay, this is a very literal looking footstool, but a footstool is a stool for your feet, right? You prop your feet up on it to rest them. Horseshoe is another one. Again, not necessarily literal like what you see here, but it is a shoe that you attach to the bottom of a horse's hoof, right, to protect it. Or a cookbook, right? A cookbook is a book for cooking, okay? So some compound words like these make a lot of sense, right? It's something that we use all the time. Headboard, right? Something that you put at the head of your bed, right? Is a board typically made of wood, Okay, a keyboard like you have on your computer, right? It has keys on it and it looks like the shape of a board. Okay, but some compound words don't always make sense, right? Something like pineapple. Okay, if you separate it into two words, a pineapple is not an apple made out of pine. Okay, or butterfly. Okay, a butterfly is not a fly made out of butter, nor is a firefly a fly made out of fire. Okay, but we use some words like this perhaps to be metaphorical. Maybe whoever came up with the word was trying to be poetic, something along those lines. So it kind of makes you wonder where some of these words come from sometimes. Okay? And again, there's not always an easy explanation or one ready at hand, okay? But it's part of what makes language so fascinating sometimes. A word like mushroom, for example, okay? It's not a room made out of mush. Or calling something a toadstool, okay? A toadstool, close cousin to the mushroom, okay? Another compound word. This is something that people might think of as a place where a toad might sit, like a stool. Okay, so again, it comes from the distant past and what people thought of, again, sometimes in metaphorical terms and sometimes in just poetic and creative terms. Okay, but some words do make sense. Thunderstorm, okay, chainsaw, right? These types of words, we recognize them because they describe what they are. Okay? So compound words, think about it sometimes, they exist all around us, whether we realize it or not. And the last word I'll say here is about numbers. Okay? Most people have this reaction when I start discussing numbers, but thankfully it's very brief and there's not much to say. Okay? When it comes to the English language, when it comes to academic writing in particular, most instructors will tell you to never begin a sentence with an actual number. Okay? Always spell out the number. Okay, so instead of beginning a sentence with the number 1, okay, begin it with O-N-E, okay, with a capital O because it's a full letter or a full word at the beginning of a sentence. Okay, so never begin a sentence with an actual number. Try to spell it out if you can. And when it comes to writing out numbers in a sentence in general, this varies when it comes to style guides, when it comes to instructors' preferences. Typically, never always spell out a number under 10, especially. But I've had some instructors even tell me in the past to spell out numbers under 100. Okay, so for the purposes of this class, I'm not too picky about it. But some instructors are along the way. Okay, so bear it in mind when it comes to numbers, but that's really all we have to say about it. So again, that's really giving you a general understanding of parts of speech and mechanics, okay, a crash course and the building blocks of English, okay? And again, English has all kinds of weird rules. It breaks these rules all the time, and eventually we'll start talking about how words mesh together to make sentences, and we'll even talk a little bit about perhaps the past and the history of words and how they ended up becoming formed in the first place, okay? So thanks for listening, and I will see you all next time.